Well, here we are yet again, ladies and gentlemen, in our next lecture on the Roman Empire. Last lecture we looked at the sort of the early empire. Now we are going to look at the empire at its height and the late empire. So let us begin sort of where we left off. We looked at Augustus, and there were successors to Augustus of the Julio-Claudian family. Uh, they were sometimes successful, sometimes not. Um, an interesting bunch of personalities and some wonderful stories. Um, but after about the year 60 of the Common Era, that first initial, the first family of the empire that were in some way related either by marriage or by blood to Augustus, were no longer in power. And you have a series of military generals called the Vespasians who take over after that. Uh, some good, some bad, some otherwise. Until you get to 96 AD, or 96 of the Common Era, and the influential Senator Nerva, who is actually distantly related to the Julio-Claudians, the first family of the empire, who comes to power. And although he wrestles with many of the problems that were still besetting the Roman state by this time, Nerva is able to actually set up a very peaceful transition, a process of succession that will continue in the Roman state for the next almost 90 years, and will produce five of the most remarkable leaders that the Roman Empire had seen. In many ways, these are the genuine heirs of Augustus in terms of competence. There was the Emperor Trajan, who was responsible for the conquest of Dacia and Mesopotamia, expanding the frontiers along the Danube and in the east. Battling, for instance, the very powerful Parthian Empire, that whether it's the Parthians or the Persians, they occupy the same area. They had traditionally been the foes of the Romans in the east and were a powerful, sophisticated military state. The only ones who could really rival the empire, the Roman Empire. The Emperor Hadrian, who, although he withdrew from Mesopotamia, thought that consolidating Roman gains were more important than continuing to expand the empire, and as a result of that, he proved himself to be very wise. He saw that the empire might have been overstretched by Trajan, and therefore decided that it was better to rule an area that Rome could defend rather than terminally weaken the empire by trying to defend areas that it just simply did not have the resources to defend. Hadrian was also a great patron of the arts. He loved Greek literature and learning, and really transformed the Roman state as a cultural center through encouraging the Greek arts. Antoninus Pius is probably the least known of the five good emperors, largely because it was such a peaceful part of this time period, and that his ambition was really to codify and reorganize centuries of Roman law codes that had built up and were somewhat disorganized. So the not so glamorous task of reforming the legal codes made Antoninus Pius a great hero among legal scholars, and allowed for the efficient functioning of the empire for centuries to come, despite having even some quite bad emperors after the year 180. Um, the last of the so-called five good emperors was Marcus Aurelius. For those of you who are familiar with the movie Gladiator, he is the man played by Richard Harris at the very beginning of the movie Gladiator. Rules for nearly 20 years, and he is responsible again for stabilizing the frontiers of the empire, both against the old foe, the Parthians in the east, in Mesopotamia, and against the Germanic tribes across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. He creates a series of buffer provinces on the other side of the Danube, that are designed to protect the mountain passes that come down into Italy. And so, really one of the first Roman generals to contend with that frontier element. Here we see a bronze equestrian of Marcus Aurelius, one of the only surviving bronze statues of a Roman emperor. This is actually no longer outside, the original is inside. But we can see Marcus there, the conquering general. Also the bearded figure here, a little bit the philosopher emperor, and he was known for his love of Greek Stoic philosophy that was all the rage in Rome, and wrote a series of meditations himself that are quite well known. And so he truly is what Plato imagined as the philosopher king, the philosopher ruler. Unfortunately, there were 5 good emperors and some not so great emperors after 180. And in particular, between 235 and 284 CE, the empire was nearly destroyed. There were a number of problems that beset the empire in what is called the crisis of the 3rd century, a nearly 50-year period of virtual chaos in the imperial state. Everything from devalued currency, where the Roman coinage was melted down and less gold put in each coin to make it worth less, to attacks from the Persians, no longer the Parthians, but now the Persian Empire in the east, as well as the Germanic tribes across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. There were a series of short-lived emperors with military backgrounds. There were nearly an average of 1 emperor every 6 months throughout this time period, so real instability in that important office. There was the continued persecution of Christians. People were disturbed by the rise of this military cult, and so there was religious instability. And out in the provinces, the municipal aristocracy was not doing well. Which had formed the backbone of the small towns that cropped up in the provinces was leaving. They were taking their money. They were sometimes burying it in the ground. They were fleeing to estates in the countryside where they could wall themselves up and hopefully ride out the disaster, rather than staying in the towns that were always the targets of the barbarian invasions. And so we see the municipal aristocrats leaving to the countryside to set up their own villas there. Another remarkable emperor comes to power in 284, whose name is Diocletian. Diocletian is the man who is basically responsible for solving the problems of the crisis of the 3rd century. He restores stability to the empire and allows it to survive for another 2 centuries. If we contrast this, for instance, with what happened in Imperial China collapses around 220. Rome nearly does the same. However, there is one who can sort of reorganize it in quite a different way. So the Roman Empire, really, after Diocletian, will be somewhat of a new organism. He stabilizes the currency. He sets a fixed value for what Roman coins should be, how much gold in that coin to how much base metal. He reorganizes a defense in-depth strategy to defend its frontiers. He continues to follow a policy of persecuting Christian minorities. He establishes a new policy for imperial succession by dividing the empire into 2 distinct administrative units, one in the east, one in the west, each under the rule of co-emperors, which he called Augustus. So there were 2 Augusti, one in the east, one in the west, and under the Augusti there were sort of vice-emperors, which were called Caesars. The idea is that when one of the Augusti retired, the Caesar would take its place, and then they would appoint a new vice-emperor underneath them. Unfortunately, what it ended up being was all of the Caesars and all of the Augusti thought that they should be the single Roman emperor, and it ended up like creating a sort of the kind of the playoffs, the Final Four. You'd have an Eastern champion and a Western champion, and then they would do battle for whoever would rule the entire Roman Empire. So, as wonderful an idea as Diocletian had here, it did not work in practice. In fact, between his retirement in 305 and 312, there's a brief period of instability when his system of succession doesn't work. However, out of that emerges another single remarkable Roman ruler, and this is Constantine. Constantine probably precipitates one of the most remarkable shifts in the history of the Western tradition. The Christian religion, which had been persecuted from the time of Nero, was continually persecuted through the time of Diocletian. Constantine, for a number of reasons, decides to end the persecution of the Christian minority and legalizes it as an acceptable religion of the Roman state. So while he may not have converted to Christianity until on his own deathbed, he did start actually diverting Roman funds, tax funds, to Christian works, to paying Christian clergy, to funding Christian buildings and churches and so forth. And this was all done out of the imperial administration. So Constantine also then builds a new imperial capital for his empire on the old Greek colony of Byzantium, which he names after himself. It's called Constantinople. And he really, for much of the time, actually will reside in Constantinople, leaving the management of the city of Rome to either his sons or to the local bishop of Rome, who tradition calls the Pope. Constantinople will become a very important new center, and as a fact, it will become a much more cosmopolitan, new, shiny imperial center that will soon begin to eclipse old Rome, and will serve as, once Roman imperial rule fails in the Western Empire, Constantinople will become the new center of the so-called Byzantine Empire that will emerge and rule from the 6th century all the way down to the 15th century in the Eastern Mediterranean. Here we have the Triumphal Arch of Constantine. What's very interesting architecturally about the Arch of Constantine is that it's not entirely a new structure. It borrows some of its elements, the columns, the bases. These small images here are all stripped from other works of art and reincorporated into this new work. That's something very different. Some art historians say that that's an example of Roman decline, but you can actually see its position right here next to the Colosseum. So, next to the Colosseum, boom, Arch of Constantine, Triumphal Arch. Okay, and you can see actually in relationship to the Colosseum how big that Triumphal Arch it is in a massive structure for a single arch. Well, for about another 50 years or so after Constantine's time, the Roman state is fairly stable under his family. Constantine is probably one of the first emperors, really, to effectively get generations of his descendants to rule after him in both the Eastern and Western Empire. After 375 CE, however, the Roman state came under increasing attack from Germanic tribes, Gothic tribes as they're called, across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. One notable instance was in 378 when a Roman imperial army under the direct command of an emperor was destroyed at the Battle of Adrianople. And this was the first time an emperor had been killed in battle against the barbarians in many years. The Emperor Julian in 363 died while on campaign, but not directly in battle. In some cases, Roman authorities were able to ally with these tribes and stop the immediate crisis. But after 378, Rome was in trouble. There were great generals who came to power. For instance, Aetius, who was able to play a game of cat and mouse against the Huns under Attila, form alliances, and at best was able to fight the Huns to a draw. By 450, the Huns, who had actually invaded the Italian peninsula, withdrew. But even a great general like Aetius doesn't last forever. There will be jealousies, there will be rivalries, and they will fall from power. And by 476 CE, other generals. And this time now, the generals are mostly come from the Germanic tribes themselves. They are the great war leaders. So the Roman emperors enlist the Germanic tribes to fight against other Germanic tribes. Um, it just seems for everyone's interest that the title of emperor was really just that, a title, and really was no longer effective. And so the signs of imperial authority, the crowns, the robes, the signets, and all those things are no longer bestowed on anyone new. Instead, they are sent back to the emperor in the east, in Constantinople, and said, we no longer need an emperor ruling from Rome. We no longer need an emperor in the west. Many people have suggested that what that meant was is that the generals who took over the government in the western provinces were really, in a sense, swearing allegiance to the Eastern Roman Emperor. The fact remains, though, is that they were all able to pursue a policy that could be radically different from what the emperor in Constantinople wanted. And so from that time, from 376 and from 476 of the Common Era, at the at the deposition of the emperor Romulus Augustulus, we would say that the Roman imperial government in the West had collapsed. In its place, a series of Germanic successor states that we will see develop, be destroyed, develop again, but will eventually merge as countries like England, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. But it's going to take us an awfully long time to get from the Western Roman Empire to modern Western Europe. And we will still see the legacy of Rome throughout the remainder of the course. Thank you very much.